welcome you today to this symposium on gender-sensitive parliaments, parenthood and politics. This event is jointly organized by BRIAS, Vrouwenraad and Zijkant, and it grew out of our shared interest in the question how politics can become more inclusive for people of different genders and for people in different phases of life. So while political representation has become more diverse over the years, political institutions themselves have not always evolved at the same pace. Many structures and many rules still make it difficult to combine a political mandate with care responsibilities, family life, and other realities people face throughout their lives. So today we ask, how can parliaments better respond to these different needs? And this question also aligns very well with the ambitions of the BRIAS program on democratic governance. For us, one of the key challenges facing democracies today is how to address structural inequalities linked to gender, race, class, age, and other forms of exclusion. And this is exactly why we're also very happy to collaborate with Vrouwenraad and Zijkant, because it allows us to bring together perspectives from academia and society in teaching or in talking about these challenges and tackling these challenges as well. So to get together, we have a very excited program here today prepared for you. We'll start with the lecture by BRIAS Senior Fellow Dr. Petra Ahrens on gender-sensitive parliaments. This lecture is in English and it fits into the BRIAS Big Ideas for Democracy lecture series. Then we'll have a panel discussion with 6 Flemish politicians in Dutch on parenthood and politics, which Johanna and Julie will tell you more about in a few minutes. Before I give the floor to my colleague Johanna van Akker from Vrouwenraad, I also want to take this opportunity to thank all those who made this event possible. So the BRIAS team, Anja and Andres in particular, colleagues from Vrouwenraad, Johanna van Akker and Charlotte Horemans, and colleagues from Zijkant, Julie Garse and Rafke Pels. So thank you all very much for the great teamwork.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Johanna van Akker. I'm the director of Vrouwenraad. De Vrouwenraad is een koepelorganisatie van 35 leden in Nederlandstalig België en Brussel. Wij zijn een belangenbehartiger en komen samen met onze leden op voor gelijkwaardige representatie van vrouwen in eigenlijk alle gelederen van de maatschappij, voor de rechten en het welzijn. In onderwijs, werk, maar ook in de politiek. Politiek moet een afspiegeling zijn van de samenleving. Om goed beleid te kunnen maken dat eigenlijk al uw burgers ten goede komt, is het belangrijk dat diverse stemmen en ook voldoende vrouwen daar een plek in krijgen. Omdat, als dat niet het geval is, zie je dat ondervertegenwoordigde groepen, minderheidsgroepen, heel vaak vergeten worden. Hun noden, hun belangen verschuiven soms naar het achterplan. Dat toont de geschiedenis keer op keer en dat toont de realiteit. 80% van de Vlaamse burgemeesters is man. 80% in 2026, maar ook in andere politieke instellingen, in parlementen en regeringen zien we dat het niet evident is om vrouwen daar op een goede manier een plek te geven en de omkadering te verzorgen als ze zwanger zijn, als ze kinderen hebben. Maar dat is ook voor mannen de dag van vandaag niet zo evident. En daar gaan we vandaag over nadenken, hoe dat beter kan morgen en in de toekomst. Voilà. Ook vanwege de Vrouwenraad een dikke merci aan Sylvia en Zijkant om dit vandaag te organiseren.
So that will move to the Big Ideas for Democracy lecture by Petra Ahrens. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Petra Ahrens, who is sitting in front here. Petra Ahrens is an Academy of Finland Research Fellow at Tampere University, where she leads the research project on the road to gender-sensitive parliaments, gender equality and democratic practices in the Finnish, German and Polish parliament compared. In this project, she examines how parliaments can become more inclusive and representative democratic institutions. Petra is truly one of the leading scholars working on gender-sensitive parliaments and gender equality in political institutions today. Her research brings together questions of gender policies and politics, political representation, and party politics, often with a specific focus on the European Union. She has published widely on these topics in leading international journals and with major international publishers. Petra received her PhD in sociology from Humboldt University in Berlin in 2014 and has since held several prestigious positions and fellowships, including a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Antwerp and a guest professorship in gender and diversity at the Free University Berlin. In addition, she's also a co-founding editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender. So it's really no surprise why we are absolutely delighted to welcome Petra Ahrens as a senior fellow at BRIAS. So in what follows, Dr. Ahrens will speak for about 40 minutes, after which there will also be time for a Q&A with the audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Petra Ahrens.
Well, yes, first of all, good morning to everyone on this Monday to start the week. And second, a very warm thank you to Sylvia Ezel and Emily van Houten for accepting me as senior fellow at BRIAS and also for making this lecture possible. It's really fantastic to be here in Brussels, back in Brussels actually. I've been here at the Institute for European Studies some 18 years ago and in such an inspiring environment. Today I'll talk about my ongoing research on gender-sensitive parliaments and integrate it with another research strand, one which engages more with the subject of democratic backsliding, anti-gender actors, and opposition to gender equality, because there are these two research strands, but they rarely speak to each other, at least in my perspective. And I'm going to try to bridge this today. In my current research project, as Sylvia already said, I compare Finland, Germany, and Poland. But in addition, together with Sylvia as well, actually, I carried out a global study commissioned by IDEA International and Inter Pares, where we explored the EU member states and 16 partner parliaments regarding changes towards more gender sensitivity in their practices. And this in large parts also provides the basis of today's lecture. Before that, I studied the European Parliament and an ERC project on the political groups and their democratic practices and how they treat gender equality inside their own workings, but also inside the Parliament in policy and politics. And we also focused a lot on anti-gender actors, radical right, and populist parties in the European Parliament. So, briefly, about the history of gender-sensitive parliaments. The first time the term appeared was officially already a good 25 years ago in 2001, when the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association published the report Gender Sensitizing Commonwealth Parliaments. So it already started from a global perspective because, of course, it's not only in the EU but also across other regions on this planet. In the following decade, several international bodies devoted themselves to the topic, such as the Interparliamentary Union, which published really various studies, guidelines, handbooks, and so on, with instruments for implementation. Assessments were developed, and this was also followed in 2016 by the OSCE, ODIHR, that's the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, but also a lot happened over the last decade with the European Institute for Gender Equality and, of course, UN Women. Parliaments are understood here as gendered workplaces that have been shaped over decades and centuries by the presence, preferences, and behavior of men MPs and men in leadership positions and administrations of parliaments. And the core concern of gender-sensitive parliaments is to grasp, question, and change this imprint to actually get to a more parity-led and more equality balanced parliament. Professor Sarah Childs from the UK and Professor Sonia Palmieri from Australia, who have been researching this topic for years, define the goals of gender-sensitive parliaments as ones that value and prioritize gender equality as a social, economic, and political objective, and reorient and transform their institutional culture, practice, and outputs toward those objectives. The definition, which forms the starting point of my own work, captures several shifts in thinking about gender equality in parliaments. So, the starting points. The first shift is one away from a too narrow focus on women in parliaments and how they change or should change the institution, towards a focus on the responsibility of parliaments themselves in realizing gender equality. In fact, many of international examples show that parliaments can, should, and are playing an active role in realizing gender equal changes. A second shift emphasizes that gender-sensitive changes are not only about improving women's presence and numbers in parliament, which is still important in almost every parliament, but also about changing gendered rules, day-to-day practices, cultures, and outputs. A third shift focuses on the idea that gender equality can be fostered within and through parliaments. This means parliaments can support gender equality within their own workings, for example, supporting women's access to positions of power, or by cultivating a gender-sensitive working culture. And also outside their own organizations, in politics and society more broadly, by fostering better democratic representation, legitimacy, and gender-positive outcomes through laws, policies, and budgets, and also through interaction with civil society. So I'm really glad that the Frauenrat is here today and co-leading this lecture. In the handbook by Sylvia and me, supported by Merel Vieremans as research assistant, from which this nice visual originates, we zoom in on 4 core aspects of gender-sensitive parliaments. Gender-sensitive parliaments are about ensuring the equal presence of and power sharing between women and men, or between all genders in parliaments, embedding women's issues and gender equality concerns in the core activities of parliaments, in lawmaking and oversight of governments, for example, by supporting parliamentary infrastructures that accommodate and value the diverse needs of people of different genders. I think we're going to dive deeper into that in the roundtable later on when it's, for example, on family friendliness of parliaments, and establishing an external outreach that connects parliaments with diverse publics and civil society organizations. We collected data on women's representation and surveyed 43 parliaments, 7 EU member states and 16 parliaments from all global regions. We had around, like as an academic, we had 24 who answered everything, which is already quite nice for us, that you get answers, and some who answered parts of and some who didn't. So importantly, the gender-sensitive parliament norm evolved alongside other crucial changes in relation to gender equality and also to LGBT rights, or rather an increasing mobilization against both gender equality and LGBTIQ rights. To be more precise, democracies have become under pressure through global crisis. First, as you probably still remember, there has been a huge pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. This also changed our parliament's work because you were not allowed to be there. You needed some kind of proxy work with the parliaments, or define, digitalize and find new ways to actually do your parliamentary work. For some, this has its benefits and downsides. We can talk about that in the question and answer if you want. But you also have violent conflicts across the globe shifting the focus to defense and security policy, but also to refugee and asylum policy. And this also, of course, often shifts the focus away from other issues, social issues, and also changes often how budget is spent. We also see a global wave of democratization, where countries where they thought they were stable democracies are spiraling downside or backsliding, undermining certain freedoms, and this is what we have to look at. But what we also experience now in almost all countries across Europe or across the globe is that you have anti-gender, anti-LGBTIQ rights and racist mobilization. And this comes from different sides, be it from religious actors, from radical right or populist governments, parties, or other political actors, or by movements and mobilizations. Importantly, this mobilization is a challenge to democracy, and it is a global challenge. And yet there exists no uniform picture. I think this is also important to note. The way this occurs rather varies greatly regional, such in the US, in Latin America, in Europe, Africa, or Asia, and is strongly influenced by national context within these regions. Overall, since 1990s, the Catholic Church and other religious organizations, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church, evangelicals in the US, countries like Qatar, promoted their ideas of gender binarity, gender complementarity, and heteronormativity as early as the World Conferences back in 1985 and Beijing Nairobi 1985 and Beijing 1995. Actual anti-gender campaigns began early in the early 2000s, depending on which country and which issue was pressing. So so-called marriage for all was one in Spain in 2004, Croatia 2006, Italy 2007. Political parties, especially right-wing and far-right ones, joined this mobilization much later. In other words, they exploited already existing mobilization structures. A tipping point arrived in the 2010s after the financial crisis with the La Manif pour tout demonstrations in France, which lasted for over 2 years and spilled over to other countries: Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, Slovakia. And please note, there is no East and West divide, which is often, generally said in public, that there is there are like some countries that are backwards generally, but this is really something which is going on across countries in Europe. What unites anti-gender, anti-LGBTIQ actors is the term gender ideology to defame progressive policies on gender equality and LGBTIQ rights. There are also 5 major issues that drive these campaigns and are supported by radical right populist and parties, radical right and populist parties, and sometimes even conservative parties. Some of them, until recently, in government in Hungary or Poland. These are same-sex marriage, including adoption rights for same-sex couples and surrogacy, reproductive rights like abortion, contraception, reproductive technologies, for example, for lesbian couples, sex education in school, combating violence against women or gender-based violence, as well as a strategy gender mainstreaming, and finally, number 5, gender studies and the defunding and abolishment. Anti-gender actors use really various strategies, many addressing directly parliaments. Demonstrations, sit-ins, blocking of events, petitions, parliamentary inquiries, referendums, collecting signatures and email campaigns, establishing of own knowledge centers, hate campaigns, and attacks of individual political actors. Radical right and populist parties in particular picked up on this mobilization and integrated it in their party programs. When in government or in parliament, when they propose amendments to existing laws or new laws and undermine existing equality structures. All of this plays out in parliaments, including for women's political representation, to which I turn next. Women now hold almost 27% of seats in lower single houses worldwide. This is a constant increase, as you can see on this slide. And you can see it's really across the globe. So it has increased since 1995. That's the inner ring until now, constantly. In Europe, the average is around 30%, so still no parity. And with Dudu Dalarup, we can say that women really have moved from a small minority to a large minority, which makes a difference in parliaments. But almost all parliaments are still far from gender balance, and in the majority of countries, women still hold less than 30% of the seats. Despite all the progress, variation across countries and parties is significant. So how do we explain that, the difference? Why is it not moving forward equally in the different countries? One of the reasons are, of course, the question of legal instruments, in other words, quotas. And I know that Belgium is a very famous case for that, how it changed over time. So gender quotas really remain the single most widely used instrument to increase women's representation, also an effective one. But the design, of course, determines the outcome, as you can see in the graphs. So the first one is effective legally binding gender quotas. And these are quotas that have specify a sufficiently high percentage for women's and men's representation, have placement rules and legal sanctions for non-compliance. Belgium is a good example for this, even though I assume that some in the room might disagree. But we can turn to that if you want to. Simultaneously, then you have like other legally binding quotas. For example, you also have some that don't have legal sanctions, or some that are appellative, or some that define a range that is already reached in the country. You also have things like voluntary party quotas, where only single parties set a quota for themselves, which doesn't affect other parties. And then you have, of course, a lot of countries that don't have any legal quotas. But as you can see, the difference is not that much often, and this, of course, depends on other aspects. Important is that just because you have quotas, it doesn't mean that it diversifies your parliament. You still have issues along criteria like age, class, ethnic background, genders in general, and this is necessarily not affected by these quotas. You also have political parties as key gatekeepers. They nominate candidates, they comply or circumvent or undermine quota rules, and they pursue ideological positioning that may or may not support quotas and other measures to increase parity. Beyond increasing women's descriptive representation and attention to issues such as women's rights, public health and poverty, gender parity and quotas produce broader democratic effects. One is analyzed by Richard Maitland already in 1993 on Norway. He analyzed Norwegian elections from 1953 to 1989, so really a long-term period, with women's representation reaching 35% already in 1985, nearly 40 years ago. And early quotas that existed back then produced some kind of tokenism, so the idea of like one woman is enough. If you have one on the list and it gets in, fair, then you're already improving. By the 1970s, women were increasingly seen as electorally valuable because they attract other voters. And by the mid-1980s, their presence was firmly entrenched, and debates about women's candidacies largely disappeared. So women politicians become normalized, and this can be really a long-term effect of quotas. So if you have quotas and start by now, wait 40 years at least, and then it might have become more normalized. The second aspect, which is important for democracy, is a study by Magda Hinojosa and Miki Kaukittesen, who studied Uruguay's 2016 gender quota law. And they found that the quota increased not only women's representation, but also their visibility. So this means seeing more women in politics boosted women citizens' political engagement and support for government, strengthened democratic processes because more citizens participate in democracy. Finally, Amanda Clayton, Diana O'Brien, and Jennifer Piscopo conducted an experiment with 17,000 respondents across 12 countries in the Americas, Europe, and Australasia. And regardless of a quota presence in the country, so you can choose if you want, if you have a quota or if you could reach parity without a quota, citizens always preferred gender balanced composition, with or without quotas, over any male dominance. So they had to choose between parity through quotas, parity through other measures, or just reaching it, and male dominance in parliament. And citizens always opted for gender balance, regardless of political position. But as said before, parties largely determine women's and men's electoral chances, and this applies to radical right and populist parties in a specific way. How does this impact descriptive representation, particularly if you don't have quotas? So first of all, you have direct effects. These parties are still often men's parties, even if you have women in leadership in many of them now. Then when you look at the MPs, for example, in Germany, I think women's MPs share is around 12-15% at the moment for the alternative for Germany in the German Bundestag. When you look at their membership and also who votes for them, it's more men's parties. This also means they often have fewer women candidates, and fewer women candidates, naturally, in most of the electoral systems, means fewer women MPs. The increasing votes for radical right and populist parties means also a shifting between parties, from those who are more gender balanced to those who are less gender balanced, which again has a direct effect on how many women are in parliament. And fewer women MPs means also you have fewer women available for parliamentary leadership positions, because of course they can't take over everything and there has to be some kind of proportionality. But there are also indirect effects. You have personal threats and attacks during election campaigns and on a daily basis, and these are often more directed against women politicians. And we already see effects of that women candidates reduce their engagement, pull back, and step back in other parties as well. So this means that you also have fewer women who are willing to become a candidate and be elected because they have to fear these attacks. The other indirect effect is, of course, when you have a lower number of women there, you also have a lower visibility because you have a certain share for media campaigns, for discussions, and so on. And this impacts the symbolic representation, which is an important signal to citizens. If you see less, remember the study on visibility from Hino Jusa and Carl Kittelsen, you will also be less engaged, likely. So this has like really broader effects. When we look at the gender-sensitive lawmaking and oversight, we must first acknowledge that the long history behind, like really long history, before we even talked about gender-sensitive parliaments, there has been like a long-term process to get to gender mainstreaming, which was developed through the UN Women's World Conferences already in Mexico in 1975, over Nairobi in 1985, and which was ultimately adopted in 1995 with the Beijing Platform for Action. In its aftermath, a lot of governments, and to way much lesser extent, the European Parliament is an exception, for example, governments started mainstreaming their policies, accompanied by processes and tools like gender budgeting, gender impact assessments, collecting gender disaggregated data, or research on gender issues and other elements tailored to countries' context. Our study showed that despite its long history, gender mainstreaming is not at all implemented, neither in governments nor in parliaments, with only 10 to 20% of those who reported back to us operating regularly with specific tools or procedures for gender mainstreaming. Gender-sensitive oversight, which includes, for instance, also monitoring compliance with international human rights and gender equality standards, and the implementation of national legislation, is a bit better implemented, with 30 to 40% of the parliaments that responded to us reporting it. But of course, 30 to 40%, there's quite some room for improvement. To emphasize some important lessons from this lawmaking oversight, rules and tools do not change practices and cultures alone. Informal processes and activities are important too, and sometimes more flexible and adaptable. And consistency and awareness raising is key to maintaining enthusiasm, particularly if critical actors are not present to push for gender equality. All policies, regardless if it's family, transport, digitalization, defense policy, or anything else, are gendered, and we have to pay attention what are the effects of it and how we can somehow promote gender equality still through them. Given the different histories, rules and procedures and context, parliaments have to find their own way how to actually do it, because one size doesn't fit all. You really need to figure out what works for your parliament to embed gender. And of course, since we also at the Brias here, access to trusted gender data analysis is critical and is really needed to predict or assess the gender impact of laws, policies, and the budget. And this means that gender-sensitive changes often result from a few critical actors still, like some figures who really push forward it, be it gender equality bodies, women's caucuses, informal cross-party networks, or simply individuals or groups of parliamentary staff. So this is the idea what you do for lawmaking oversight. But when we look at the potential of radical right and populist parties, how they might impact substantive representation, again, some direct effects, which means, for example, reframing policy issues, turning human reproductive rights as family and or child protection, so undermining basic human rights by just labeling it differently and making another argument out of it, promoting stereotypical gender roles instead of, for example, equal care responsibilities. This means you would have policies that promote women staying at home, running the household, and taking care of the children, instead of fighting for both, or like whatever parents you have, participating in raising the children to an equal share. It also means homo or feminationalism, so the idea that they abuse equality arguments to fight against refugees, to hold arguments against migrants who are supposed to be different and holding not equality positions that are usual in the country. So it's a bit hypocritical and also paradoxical that they use equality arguments to actually exclude other groups of the population. And of course, what we see in a lot of countries is the attempt to abolish, or actually do abolish gender and queer studies, as we have lately seen a lot of these things going on in the US. But there are also, of course, indirect, or maybe even direct effects. You have the normalization of some fact-free statements. So they state something that it would be like this or that. They play the victim. And since it's constantly repeated, it becomes normalized in the political discourse, and it's really hard to tackle back on that. And of course, the lack or dismissal of gender expertise throughout policies and society to say like, okay, this is not real research, this is just ideological or whatever. So these are effects that will also impact substantive representation. When we look at that with the example in the European Parliament, they really had a strong impact on the discourses there. So like direct and indirect opposition in their strategies against gender equality. And there are some practices in the European Parliament, like this cordon sanitaire, but these are becoming more patchy and often at the individual level, as you probably remember with the latest scandal around the WhatsApp group with the European People's Party chatting with radical right parties on how to get to a stricter asylum policy on the EU level. You also see in the European Parliament that there is a quite hostile atmosphere against gender equality. But what we also found in our research is really a cleavage along party clusters. So you have the defenders, which comprise the Greens, the Left, the Social Democrats, and Renew Europe, which frame gender equality and LGBTQ rights as inseparable from human rights and as core markers of European identity, progress, and democratic values. By contrast, the so-called reframers, consisting of the European conservatives and reformers, and back then identity and democracy, now Patriots for Europe, Europe of Sovereign Nations somehow, they challenge these understandings of the defenders by reframing equality debates around sovereignty, subsidiarity, religion, and cultural protection. So LGBTIQ rights, for example, are often portrayed as ideologically driven and in conflict with national or religious traditions. So this is how they try to oppose and bring up fact-free arguments. Finally, the European People's Party is really sitting on the fence here. And this is quite ambivalent, because while publicly defending human rights and equality in parliamentary debates, they're internally really divided, and this can tip either this or that way. And when I don't know who's familiar with the current majorities in the European Parliament, it really makes a difference to which side the European People's Party is leaning, if they are more lining up with the radical right and populist political groups there, or with the center-left and Green parties on the other side. And this will make a difference for gender equality, LGBTIQ rights, or any kind of rights you have in the European Union. So, coming to the third core aspect, internal organization of parliaments, something we're going to dive into deeper today. This refers, on the one hand, to infrastructures comprising physical spaces and visual elements, like think of your own parliament, whose portraits or statues are there, who is presented, which women or genders are visible, which kind of origin is visible, who are the artists who can exhibit, who is bought in, and what kind of art is shown. You also may want to consider whether women and men are equally valued in how parliamentary buildings or rooms are named. So in some countries you have names for the parliaments, and this makes a difference on how it's shared. Italy, for example, inaugurated in 2016 in Sala del Donna, celebrating the first women who entered the political institutions of the Italian Republic. Among them now also Giorgia Meloni as first prime minister. Trinidad and Tobago is a very interesting case because they renovated their central parliamentary lobby and turned it into a rotunda gallery. And they have now, for example, exhibitions focusing on women every year, both on the International Women's Day and during November. And the gallery also explicitly supports work of women artists, giving them a platform and helping them to move on to commercial platforms, galleries, and to foster their careers. And although the exhibitions for the International Women's Day also accept men artists, mostly women artists have taken up this opportunity to present their work in the gallery. Other important internal organization aspects concern bathrooms as most parliaments provide at best an equal number for toilets for women and men. And you know, this is not only parliaments, we all know. You have that like almost everywhere you go, which doesn't make sense because women, to even out the bathroom times, there has been quite some interesting research on that. Women require about 2 to 3 times the time men need because of biological functions or because they are still primary caregivers and take their children with them. And, for example, providing gender-neutral toilets can also ensure access for parents accompanied by their children, but also by people accompanied by disabled relatives of the opposite sex, and of course also for transgender, non-binary, and intersex people who don't have to be forced to choose if they don't want to. When talking about parents, our study found that the provision of childcare facilities in the parliaments or arrangements for breastfeeding mothers or parents feeding babies are still not widespread, despite the importance for staff. I don't know if you can read it, but the provision of childcare facilities is 35% only in the parliaments surveyed. Breastfeeding is only in 32%, and arrangements for parents for feeding babies is only in 23%. So there is already quite a gap. So overall, the internal organization is not only this infrastructure, but generally the organization of parliamentary work, and it's closely connected to what we just showed on childcare facilities. Even if there are facilities, other aspects need to be attended to make parliaments more family friendly, like adjusting sitting hours, possibilities of proxy voting, as we, for example, had for some time during the pandemic, aligning sittings with school calendars, for example, or paid parental leave, also for MPs and not only for everyone else employed there. Next to family friendliness, of course, a violence-free parliament is core to the organization of parliamentary work, and it requires a broad conceptualization, way beyond physical violence. So it encompasses also in collecting the data, introducing policies and procedures to prevent or at least address harassment, discrimination, abuse, and misconduct. In 2012, Bolivia was the first country in the world to legally recognize and criminalize political violence and harassment against women as a part of a broader process of constitutional change. And this was really pushed forward by a large mobilization of feminist and indigenous women's activists. So this is the idea about the internal organization. But what we see continuously now with changes in parliaments is that you have direct effects of hostile, sexist, racist, homophobe, or transphobe atmosphere, where people are actually directly attacked in parliament. Confrontative speech style and other tactics, like plenary questions just to interrupt. Questioning MPs with small children, criticizing breastfeeding, in the sense of why are you not at home with your child, particularly for mothers, of course. Preventing rule changes or turning back the wheel, or expressing also nationalism. This means, for example, through heteronormative and masculinist expressions. And these, of course, also have indirect effects. When you have a lot of confrontative style and interruptions, it will prolong the sitting hours through these tactical interventions, which is, of course, harder for people with smaller children or with any other kind of health issue. And for some parliaments, at least for some of the people I talk to, is that there are actually some no-go areas because of radical right and populist parties in parliamentary building for trans people, because they really fear to be attacked. And this means, of course, undermining democracy and reducing the participation. Finally, which is, again, very important when you look at the external, at civil society organizations, is the external outlook or the external outreach. Gender-sensitive parliaments actually would value building connection between them and women in society, or generally with marginalized communities. And there are many possibilities to do so, as shown by parliaments in our study. Some initiatives are more common than others. Most of the parliaments organize occasional or frequent consultation with women's movements and civil society organizations. This can happen formally by inviting civil society organizations to committee hearings or consulting them in the legislative process. Or informally, when they are consulted by parliamentary actors, women's caucuses, parties, or individual MPs to address issues that are not equally discussed through formal channels, through formal channels and on the political agenda. Our handbook featured many examples from a variety of countries where women see civil society organizations have been successfully consulted with a clear impact. For example, in Malaysia, we had the story of a coalition of women's civil society organizations who offer flexible support to MPs on key gender issues. So whenever they have a question, they will offer to collect the data, because it's not that they have such a strong research on that yet, offering legislative expertise, helping with gender mainstreaming training, or monitoring parliamentary proceedings. A new way of engaging with citizens is also through citizens' assemblies and juries. And also, although not very common, there are recent examples from the Irish Parliament, which has established citizens' assemblies focusing on gender issues and gender equality, and particularly on family friendliness. Then you have issues like where you look on education, like many parliaments organize public tours, have cultural events and something like that. And other initiatives are the organization of women's parliaments, for example, in Catalonia. You probably heard of that last week when Tanja Verge was presenting here. Training and mentoring programs for women. And these are issues where you can try to actually move forward with that. Of course, this also has radical right parties have an impact on civil society management. In some countries, you have democratic backsliding through so-called gongos, not international non-governmental organizations, but governmental organized non-governmental organizations. So instead of supporting independent civil society, they create their own civil society, which then implements or pushes for their understanding of gender equality in society. The definancing or banning of support and mobilization structures, for example, women's shelters, pride parades. I think we have Pride Week now in Brussels. Excluding women's and LGBTIQ representatives from hearings. This might also be something that they try to do in some countries. Or inviting anti-gender actors to hearings. And when you look at the and the indirect effects, this is also, of course, impeding feminist democratic representation. So you have less accountability, less transparency, less exchange between parliaments and civil society. When we now look at an example from Germany, where I'm originally from, what you can see how a conflictual parliamentary environment along party lines impacts gender equality and LGBTIQ rights. Since 2022, the rainbow flag was hoisted on the German Bundestag for the Christopher Street Day in Berlin, and for the Eiderhot, so the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. And the rainbow flag was even formally added to the flag etiquette of the German Bundestag, next to the German and the European Union flag, which are prominently displayed. What happened last year was that the new Bundestag parliamentary president, Julia Klöckner, contested the flying of the rainbow flag, claiming the parliament needs to remain neutral and only showing the German and the EU flag. But there were already several occasions where the Bundestag used other flags. Of course, the EU flag, but also like the Ukrainian one when the war started. So neutral here is interestingly not defined as defending democracy by supporting inclusion and being openly for LGBTIQ rights, but by refraining from showing public solidarity and support for marginalized groups. The reaction from the center and left parties inside and the broader public was equally creative as it was visible. The parliamentary groups, for example, dressed in as a rainbow flag while sitting in the plenary to protest the taking down of the flag. And civil society was rolling out a 400 square meter flag in front of the Bundestag. So what we see here were conservative and radical right parties openly resisting equality claims, and left and center parties currently mobilizing to keep the status quo and not even to extend rights. So, to come to a conclusion. Building on this, the question is no longer how to get more women into politics. The question is how political institutions like parliaments and parties themselves become more gender sensitive and resilient against attacks against equality issues. The concept of gender sensitive parliaments, strongly promoted by international organizations, provides tools and guidance for this change. And I hope you remember the 4 core elements we had in the beginning: ensuring equal presence and power sharing, integrating gender equality into lawmaking and oversight, creating inclusive parliamentary infrastructures, and strengthening outreach to diverse publics and civil society. And with that, we really have to see that we have 3 core points that we have to follow. Parliaments, parties, and actors within play an active role in actually moving forward this gender-sensitive change. It's not for only the women. Changing does not only mean looking at the numbers, but also at the rules, the practices, the culture, and the outputs. And gender equality should be supported within and through parliaments and also by the parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Now we have some time for a Q&A for questions and answers. So who has a question? Who dares to go first?
Thank you very much, Petra, for this very nice talk. I have a question. It's a bit of a reflective question on what do you think the future will bring? Because you seem to present 2 conflicting dynamics. On one hand, there's this idea or this norm that we want more gender-sensitive parliaments, but on the other hand, we also see that these radical right parties, they become more prominent, more popular. And so if we want to have any kind of change made within parliaments, there's a counter dynamic going on there that these radical right parties will not provide or will not bring that change. So how do you see this developing over time? And is there a way to make these more radical conservative parties also on board to support these developments?
Yes, thank you. Good question. If I would love to be able to answer. So just some reflections maybe. I think one of the core things that I appreciate about the idea or the norm of gender-sensitive parliaments is that they should function regardless of which parties are inside the parliament, right? We know this might not be the case, but if you start a change, the idea is really that this functions regardless who's there. When we, for example, look at what kind of public outreach you have, who is presented in paintings or whatever, how the general organization of parliamentary work is organized, like sitting hours, how you communicate and things like that. I think this is something where we can actually, where parliaments should, take a leadership role and just, establish rules that work regardless of who is there. This is important. Of course, these will be challenged and maybe undermined depending on the majorities. But in most of the countries, or like in several countries, it's not that you have like a 2/3 majority of radical right or populist parties that can actually outrule everyone else. You have that in some countries, maybe for some time, but as you can see, there is always the chance for change, as in Hungary. We don't know yet where it leads. Also, Poland has had a change, and I think this gives us some hope that change is always somehow possible. And if you already, secure a baseline from which to start, you can improve from that one onwards in the future. And it's like, for example, the Belgian quota law. I mean, it started very simple, but it has been changed and improved over time because you saw that this didn't work well in the original sense. And I think this is the same with gender-sensitive parliaments. You will start to change some things, and then you will check again and figure out, okay, this is still not sufficient, and this is how you should move forward. But I think the idea of that parliaments themselves are responsible and it's not just free-floating, and that, for example, MPs have to sign a code of conduct that they can be held accountable for. I think these are things that could work and make parliaments at least a little bit more resilient and securing democratic practices.
Okay, next question.
Also, thank you for a really, really clear and super lecture. It was super interesting to see how things have evolved, and I'm amazed at how optimistic you seem to be, given what's going on these days. I have basically a half question. What I find so fascinating is how the knowledge produced around gender and politics has been used against us so successfully that the right has been able to read gender mainstreaming and de-mainstream gender across the board, and I think particularly of the case of the United States, where it's really clear that this idea that gender is everywhere is to take gender out of everything as much as you can. So it's the same thing as the civil rights anti-discrimination being used for white men, and then this going into institutions and trying to de-gender them based on the research that gender experts had done. Just an observation, and you'll be here for a while. In the Belgian situation, the government formations government formations go on a long time in this country, as you probably know, and we had one in Brussels and also nationally. And what I found fascinating was the incredible disappearing woman, that the major partners that were in the media, they were almost all men. Some women dropped out. I don't know comparison between Germany and Belgium, if you want to say anything about a country like Belgium, which has been in the forefront in terms of concrete measures, has gone in actual practice backwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's like I see the irony. It's like we're doing all the hard work. Then it's like, oh, if you find out this is where we have to tackle, or like where we can undermine, or where we can throw it back at them. It's hard to deal with that, or like to accept that this is going. It can be used the other way around, or that you have these kind of like counter movements. As for the visibility of women, as what you said, like you have to share, but in the actual practice, it's missing. I think when we return to the question of parliamentary practices or like gender-sensitive parliaments, this is exactly one rule you could have, right? You say like, okay, if you have so and so many leadership positions, it has to be so and so. It has to be parity, or like they have to show it like that. Or if you have like public speeches or so on, you have to talk about who's presenting, that it can't be an all-male panel or something like that. And this is the question is like, which parties can you get to do what, right? I mean, that's always a difficulty. And just to give you an example from the Finnish parliament, which I have been studying, where not in this legislature, but before, they had almost parity. And you probably remember the Sanna Marin government with like all the women leaders. Interestingly enough, in the parliament, it was the opposite. So the faction leaders, the political group leaders, were almost all men, to balance out the women leaders from the government, in a sense. And then they said like, yeah, okay, so now, and I asked like, yeah, okay, so is this something you did before as well, that you only had like then inside the parliament women leadership when you had like an all-male government? And they were like, no, so this wasn't something that came up to the mind, but they noticed it. So they also realized that sometimes when you had like delegations visiting, and then you take pictures, and you only have like 2 or 3 women on the picture when it's a parliamentary group, because the parliamentary group leaders come. And then I say, okay, the problem is then you don't have the women there because they're in the government, in the positions, but not in the parliament. And then you suddenly end up with a false picture, or like what you describe also for Belgium, that you actually have the share of women, but they're just not in the positions where they are visible. So this is, of course, a problem that you need to tackle. And they said, like, but then you have like some other difficulties, because they're like, of course, we could send someone else, but then you have foreign delegations coming, and if you send like the vice chair, they feel devalued because not the actual leader of the political group is coming. So these are things that they were talking about and that they are working on. Yeah, but it hasn't become easier, no.
Any other questions?
otherwise can I just add like on the first question still? Sorry. I was just like, because, you asked about, because I think in our mind, we're always in Western Europe or in European Union countries and so on. But actually, some of the most massive changes you had are in countries that you don't think of, where you think, okay, if they can do it, why can't we do it, right? You have the OSCE with the ODIHR, which has been in countries like Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they have been working with the parliaments to improve the situation. And these are not really the countries where you have like a lot of green left or whatever parties, neither in government nor in parliament. And I think that's the amazing point, that when you actually talk about how do you want to work in the parliament, changes the perspective of the MPs who are there. Sorry.
No problem. I was wondering how much research already has been done on the position of radical right female members of parliament and their position in this whole debate. Because, I mean, there's no doubt, obviously, that the radical right agenda puts the whole equality agenda under pressure in terms of political point of views. But I am personally fascinated by female members of parliament from the radical right parties, because the ones that I know, well, obviously have very opposing views to mine, but are still proud parliamentarians that want to have their voice heard, want to have their seat around the table. And so especially when it comes to the organization of parliaments, and accommodating the way we organize ourselves, I would be interested to see how they position themselves. For example, when it comes to our right to vote when we're pregnant, or how we organize childcare facilities. So, is there research on that? If not, I think that's very interesting to look at.
I think there are of course there's a lot of research generally on radical right populist parties, also on their female leaders. I think less so still inside the parliament and leadership positions, or how they react in parliament, generally as MPs, but also in leadership positions. Correct me if I'm... No, they agree. Thank you. Good. Just like securing here. And I think this is exactly the point where it gets to people, right? Where it's like, okay, to be honest, I think no one is really loves like long sitting hours after midnight or whatever. Everyone wants to see their family, even if you're not like the main caretaker or whatever. So this is exactly, I think this is the hook where you can actually change things inside the parliament to more gender sensitivity, or to more gender equality, to actually recognize this should be a workplace that is not hurting people, that should, that is valuable, that people like to work at, because this is what it should be like in your normal work as well, if possible. And I think this is actually where you get people. And I agree with you. I think this is particularly one where you get probably more women of the conservative and radical right and populist parties to join these positions, because they of course also see the pressure and that. And you're not in parliament to be invisible, right? I mean, totally correct. Of course they want to be also in leadership positions, otherwise they wouldn't put themselves up as candidates. Yes, but yes, more research.
Actually, I also have a question. So you might have noticed, Petra, so a lot of students are also in the room, right?
Yes.
And some of them, I know, are also involved in youth wings of political parties, in youth parliaments, for instance. Also on the organizational team of these events and these activities. And I was wondering, like, if they want to become more gender sensitive, what would be like the first step that they could take, or what would be your advice towards them?
You mean particularly to the
younger people who would organize youth parliaments and would be involved in youth sections of parties? Yes.
I think, you can, I encourage you to use this as a blueprint somehow. You can go through through our study, because what applies to parliaments in general also applies to youth parliaments, of course, that you have to watch out for, to make sure that you have parity, and that it's not just like, you know, the standard, what you also have usually among MPs, but that you diversify again around ethnic background, around, well, age probably not for the youth parliaments, but still you can think about what you call youth. I think in Germany the youth organizations are up to 40 years in some of the parties. So yes, I know. But also around, you know, religion, whatever you can think of, to make sure that, you know, that you find a way to discuss these issues, and also to open up a space to actually exchange on what are the problems. Because you might not, you know, when you're from a majority group, you might not be able to see it. You might not be able to recognize it, so you really need to listen to each other to see what are the problems and what are things I don't see. This also includes, for example, family-friendly organization. You know, like, do you organize childcare when you have events, for example? Do you have, like, when do you actually hold these things? How much time in advance you plan? But also on the topics you put on your events, like, you know, what are the policy issues you talk about? And do you actually treat gender issues there? Do you invite gender experts to talk about these issues, even if you think it has nothing to do with gender? There's always someone. If you don't find them, ask me. I know how to find them. And this, of course, these are all aspects that you should think of, like how to actually become more inclusive and more responsive to each other, and to listen to each other, to ensure that the next generation is already more diverse when it enters the, you know, like the regular parliament. I think that's the important part of it. And then, of course, since, you know, when I say next generation, you're also in a party, right? Try to change your own party, because it's not only about the parliaments, but actually to hold the ones who are in your party for a long time, hold them accountable for the changes you want to bring up. I think that's an important part of it.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions or not? Yes, Lise.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. Yeah, I have two questions, and it's on two different actors. So the first actor is, to what extent do voters support such measures? And I was also wondering, especially in the context that we're in now, if you look at the coalition government, you have a socialist party that's more left-leaning and might be more supportive towards such measures, but at the same time, they have to work with right-wing parties that maybe, you know, if you talk about breastfeeding or other such measures, might be a bit resistant to that, or might get backlash on that from radical right opposition and stuff. So I was wondering, how should a party actually conduct itself in that way? Should they maybe focus on subtle things, try to change things in a subtle way, or should they be more open about it, or should they focus on the framing, how to appeal to coalition partners? So yeah, those are my two questions.
Yes, thank you for the question. I'd be happy if I would know how to, you know, advise the political parties on exactly that. To start with, the first was what is supporting such measures. I mean, for me, it's always hard to imagine that, you know, citizens would want to, you know, to put extra burden or extra pain on their representatives, right? So everyone wants to have, like, yeah, well, okay, some people are taking the hard, like, in the sense of, like, you know, you have workplace protections in other areas, and I think these should just apply to the parliament as well. And I think this is an argument that holds and should be there. How much, you know, it's like, what they actually support is, of course, dependent on the party often, you know, what are acceptable topics and what are not. So, for example, when you talk about, in some countries, about gender-neutral toilets, when you start, you know, you wouldn't get, in Germany, you wouldn't get the support from a lot of parties. They would like, okay, no, this is like going against whatever. You have like the whole trans-exclusionary radical feminist discussions, particularly in the UK and so on. But for example, the Swedish parliament has gender-neutral toilets since the 1990s. No one is talking about that. So sometimes it's just about, you know, establishing things and taking them as normal. And it's also not, you know, it's like there's constantly changes going on in parliaments about these rules and these practices, how to handle this or that. And it's not that, you know, that this is constantly in the public. It's just like, you know, changes to the administration or to the working procedures of parliaments. And I think this is how you should handle it with gender equality and equality issues in general, saying like, okay, you find a solution in the parliament, and if the parliament, if the parties represented there agree, why would anyone else, oppose it, or why would you even talk about it? Because it's, it's just like an agreement of change of rules. For example, also like in Finland, with they have the rule that like in other countries as well, but in Finland also they changed it already like early 2000s. The president just decided that the voting on legislation will always take on certain days in the morning. In Germany, it's always, you have the whole plenary debate, and when that is over, then you have the voting, which can like, last forever. In Finland, you can also like continue debating like the whole night if you want to, but voting takes place the next day and not during the debate or at the end of the debate, which totally changes the picture for those who have like other things to do. Right, so you can still stay there and debate, and I think there's research lacking on that, but it would be interesting to see. I would suppose that the debates probably became even shorter because you don't have the voting there, or like people leave. So this is one of the things that you can just impose, and then it changes, and this is just your working procedure. That's it. When it comes to the parties, I think it's difficult to say like do it this way or that way, because it of course depends on what's the atmosphere in the coalition government, for example. What's the kind of communication you have. Do you have like also like, do you adopt positions in majority? In many coalition governments, you have it like that each party arrives with certain things they want to get through, and then you have like some kind of negotiation of what actually gets through, right? So make it a point in the negotiations, maybe. And how to convince them? I still think that the idea of like making the parliament a nicer place to work at should hold for everyone. But maybe I'm too positive and optimistic here. So we'll see probably in the roundtable we have soon.
Also looking at the clock, we have time for one short, very short question. So if there's one, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your interesting presentation, and thank you for the audience also for the interesting questions and the answers you've given. Maybe one small and last question I had is, what do you think working towards gender-sensitive parliaments could mean for access to politics for underrepresented groups? So thinking about people with lower socioeconomic backgrounds, younger people, people with ethnic minority backgrounds, what could it mean for them to work towards these gender-sensitive parliaments and their access to politics, but also maybe in how it could develop their political ambitions, seeing that parliaments become more friendly and open to people like them? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the very good question. Because I think this is actually the point. When you start talking about what is actually going on in the parliament, who is actually there, how do we actually work, this already reveals a lot on, who can actually access and participate in these kind of processes. And we already know that, if you have like just becoming a candidate or like engaging in politics, if you lack the financial resources to do so, it's really hard. So this also, of course, means there are questions like how do parties finance or support campaigns, right? And if they want to diversify. But I think that when you get into this process by looking at what is actually going on here and how do we handle certain things, will open up also the debate on other issues, because it's like then you will realize, okay, in certain committees you only have like sorry for the stereotypes, middle-aged white heterosexual man with a high income, and you don't have like anyone else like more critical voices there. And I think this is something where you recognize that it's quite homogeneous in some areas, and then you need to talk about do you want to change it, and how can you actually change it? And then again the question is like, what can the parliament do to change it, and what can parties do to actually change it? And I think these are always the two levels you have to think about, because like of course when you're in parliament, parliaments can change the rules, but the parties arrive with the people who are there and also with their positions and so on, and this is where you have to ultimately work on. But I think by talking about these issues will also help to point out where there are other deficiencies or where there are other problems that you haven't tackled and who is not represented and whose voices are not heard. Also, when you look at, for example, gender mainstreaming in lawmaking, you know, how do you actually make laws and legislation better so that it promotes gender, promotes equality? There you will see, like, you know, when you have legislation in social issues, how will it affect the different classes, right? Like, or when you give like benefits for, you know, now you suddenly have increasing prices for fuel. So then you, in Germany, you know, the idea was, we're just gonna, you know, put in money so that people can get their fuel cheaper, realize it's going to the companies anyway. But when you calculate it, you will see that there's, like, depending on your income, you will benefit from it in different ways and how much you use a car and something like that. So of course, when you look at these issues and take gender seriously, this is not like a binary between women and men, but really gender in a very complex setting on interwoven and intersecting with age, income, ethnic background, religion, and whatever category plays a role in a country. I think this is the core way we can actually look into it. Thank you.
That's a wonderful way to conclude the lecture. So thank you so much, Petra, for this very interesting lecture. And we will take a break now and until, just going to check, I think 10:30? No, 11:30. 11:30 even. And I will reconvene with for the debate with the politicians. So see you very soon.
Thank you too.